forth.
Yes. So thank you guys all so much for being here. This is a wonderful size group. I didn't know what to expect. And I do know that Professor McVaugh is going to come in a little late, and that's fine because I was always late to his class, I'm sure. And then another professor will be joining us. But just to set the tone, like, we're going to speak for a while, but this is very casual. We'd love questions at the end, where you'll see that we're very open about our story.
Mm-hmm.
So we'd love to talk more or answer any questions that you guys might have. So welcome. I am so grateful to be here. I'm Susie Shaw, class of 2000, and it's such a trip to be back here. I haven't been back for 25 years. And this is my husband, Nick Shaw. Sadly, he went to Georgetown.
I got into Colgate, though, but I went to Georgetown, yeah.
And we're really grateful that you guys showed up today to listen to our story. It's a very personal story, but I think it's also very universally meaningful. And, it's a story of loss and love and hope, and how to survive when your world gets turned upside down. And just to note, the slides are just some pictures of our family. Some of William, some of Kai, and then our son Bodhi as well. So they're just going to be circulating in the back.
Yeah. So thank you guys for being here and giving us the time and space to share our story, because it obviously is extremely meaningful to us, and we believe that what we have to say, it can help. So that's why we're here to do this. And it's especially an honor for me to be here, because I've never actually seen Colgate, and so I get to see the place where my wife went to college and began to form as a woman, which is pretty cool. Now, Susie and I met on a blind date back in 2002 in Manhattan. Come on in.
Come on in. Hi.
Highs for later.
Sorry. It's exciting. It's Devin. Front row.
Absolutely, yeah.
Front row's open
grab a
here.
Seat, grab a seat. Just getting started.
Don't mind us. We're sitting.
So yeah, we met in a blind date in New York, 2002. This is before like Match.com and Hinge. We did it the old-fashioned way. We were introduced by a mutual friend of ours, and I still remember the moment I walked into her apartment building on the Lower West Side of Manhattan and met her for the first time, and we had a spark, we had a connection, even in those first moments. And it's interesting when you meet that person you're going to spend the rest of your life with, your spouse, your partner. In that first meeting, you don't necessarily think about all the things you're going to go through together, right? All the intense highs and the painful lows. And never in a million years would I have thought that, after meeting this wonderful woman there in New York so many years ago, that we would confront one of the most challenging things that a family and a couple can face, and that's the loss of a child. On February 19th, 2019, while we were on a ski vacation in Big Sky, Montana, our oldest son, William, who was 9 at the time, he died in a freak and tragic ski accident. And in that moment, we lost an amazing, loving, wonderful little boy. And when I say we, I don't just mean us, I mean the world. He was kind, he was caring, he was compassionate. He's what this world needs more of. And we lost that. And in that moment, our lives were literally turned upside down. Lives that at one point seemed so certain and filled with hope, as you are when you're starting a young family and sort of in that stage of life, everything was completely ripped away from us. And in those early days of figuring out what had just happened to us, we didn't quite understand how we were going to make it through. It was like we were looking into this abyss of darkness, and we just couldn't see out the other side. And here we are, and we made it out the other side. 6.5 years later, both Susie and I are very proud of how far we've come, how far our family's come. And what we want to talk about today is the lessons we've learned through this tragedy. And although these lessons were learned through the loss of a child, we believe they can apply to any challenge that a family will face, because guess what? That's what life's about. There are going to be challenges we face, and I think what we can share today can be helpful to a couple and a family as you face whatever challenge might come down your way. And so we're going to talk about 3 topics. The first is really about our relationship as a couple and how that helped us kind of endure and come out the other side. We're going to talk about our ability to ask for help and be vulnerable was supremely important in helping us get through this. And then lastly, we're going to talk about how both of us got to a place of acceptance, which is ultimately where you want to get to when you face this kind of thing, by finding ways to make meaning out of even the worst of tragedies.
So not too long ago, we were giving a similar lecture. And during the Q&A period, a woman raised her hand and asked me the question, Susie, how did you not become a statistic? Because in her mind, any couple that goes through the loss of a child is definitely going to get divorced. They will not be able to survive something so big. And I told her that it's not actually the death of the child that causes couples to fall apart. There's already something wrong in the marriage. There's turmoil, there's stress of one sort or another. And then the death of a child is so large and needs so much care in the marriage that it's just not able to be overcome. And so, yes, those families probably will end up in divorce. But for Nick and I, we had cultivated this wonderful foundation in our marriage. I mean, it wasn't a perfect marriage, but we had this wonderful base of a foundation of transparent communications and our shared values. And those were sort of, the baseline to be able to survive what seemed like an insurmountable experience at the very beginning. And I just want to encourage you, if you're just starting out in your relationships, or if you're halfway through, now, it's really important to cultivate that early and then keep checking in with each other. Are your values still aligned? Do you still share the same things? Because when crisis hits, if you guys aren't aligned with each other, it's going to be really hard to be able to survive something like that. Like the death of a child. So you guys don't know Nick, but he is a planner, and he always has been. He is so organized and he is so structured. That was not me. I was constantly losing my keys, always running out of gas. I ran out of gas a few times. And I was the girl running through the airport trying to catch my plane at the very last minute. That doesn't happen in the Shaw family. We are 2 hours early to every flight, or three hours if it's international. So when we first got together, shortly after our marriage, we were spending a lot of time where I grew up in Falmouth. And we decided to be very intentional about our relationship. We went down to the harbor. We had a poster board and we had markers. And we created a life plan. We sort of mapped out what we wanted for ourselves as individuals, ourselves as a couple. My brother, who was also a Colgate alum, he made fun of us. He thought it was so silly. But it really helped us to set the tone for our marriage. We talked about, what we wanted for our family. And it really, really helped us align early on. We all know that plans, life doesn't go according to plans. And the death of our son was not on that plan. But I think the sheer fact of us doing that plan and checking in with each other was really, really instrumental to where we are today and how we got through our loss.
Absolutely. And we didn't realize, obviously, years later, how that plan would serve us. And it did serve us. And many people did make fun of us and this is kind of cheesy, but it served us immensely, particularly as we were trying to figure out how to deal with the loss of our son William. Because if you think about parents, as parents, we are the heads and leaders of our family. Professionally, I'm an executive coach. I work in the leadership development space, and I work with a lot of leaders and leadership teams. And I've seen what happens when leadership teams aren't aligned. And so for us, it was really important that we were aligned, particularly as we were going to be facing the biggest challenge of our lives. And that meant having conversations, having dialogue, trusting one another. And there was a singular moment that really sort of epitomized this for us literally right after the accident. You see, I was with William when the accident happened. I was a bit in front of him, so I actually didn't see what happened, and he went missing for a bit of time. And a search ensued. Ski patrol was on site and trying to find him. They had sent me to the bottom of the mountain to see if he somehow skied past me and was in the lodge. And Susie and I were in a constant, communicating constantly, and she had decided to go back to the cabin we rented to see if William had somehow made it back there. And eventually they found William, and they were going to bring him to the ski patrol clinic to get treated. And then they took me there to be there for when that happened. And I told Susie that that's what was happening, so she was getting ready to leave the cabin and make her way to that clinic. And while I was waiting for Susie, the lead doctor came out and delivered the devastating news that William had died. And in that moment, I went into a complete state of sort of shock and shutdown. When you get that kind of news, you just can't make sense of it rationally. So your brain is trying really hard to make sense of it, but you can't. I was skiing with him and having the time of our lives literally an hour and a half before, and now I just heard the news that he died. So I went into complete shutdown mode and was just sitting in this clinic waiting room alone, just staring into nothingness. And as that was happening, then a thought came into my head, and that thought was that I'm not alone in this ordeal. I had Susie and I had our younger son, Kai, who was 6 at the time, and I was going to have to tell them. I was going to have to deliver the news that William was dead. And that scared me to death, because I didn't know how she would react. I didn't know how it would impact our marriage. I mean, the level of uncertainty that I was toiling with in that moment, coupled with the guilt that I was feeling, because I was with William when it happened, it was just tearing me apart. And I don't know how long it took for Susie to eventually get there, but it seemed like an eternity. But she did eventually get there. And as she entered into the clinic, we were about 10 feet apart. And I told her that William had died. And as you can imagine, she crumbled to the ground and just, obviously overtaken by emotion. But when she composed herself, she stood up and walked to me, put both hands on my shoulders, looked me in the eye and said, "It's not your fault. It's not your fault." Now, it's an amazing act of kindness, of compassion. It probably will be the single most and deepest and most meaningful act of kindness and compassion sort of turned towards me that I'll ever experience. And when she said that, she not only saved me, but she saved our family. And she set the tone for how we were going to endure this thing. And it set the tone for a conversation we would have a couple of days later when we got back to Massachusetts, where we had what I call a look in the eye moment, and we looked at each other in the eye and we said, we are not going to let this destroy our family. We're not going to let this destroy our family because we had a 6-year-old son, Kai, and we need to do everything in our power to fight for him. And we're not going to let it destroy our family because we know in our hearts it's not what William would have wanted. And so there you go. There was the alignment we had sort of forged on that dock in Falmouth years ago. It was serving us in that moment, and that set us on a path to getting through this as a couple and as a family intact.
So it's so important for a couple to be able to find that empathy in moments of crisis. I certainly hadn't prepared to say that to Nick. It just sort of came instinctually. I actually thought that, I didn't know William was dead on the way down. I thought that he maybe had been severely injured. We're going to get him the help he needed. We were going to get home. Everything was going to be fine. But when I saw Nick in that clinic, I immediately understood that he felt that it was his fault, right? I could see that he was carrying that burden of guilt. And I knew in that moment that the best thing I could possibly do was to release him from that burden, because I knew that it could have been me. It could have been me with William. It could have been me with my son, Kai. It wasn't his fault, and I needed him to know that. And so instinctually, I said that. And again, it's really hard to do, but if you can cultivate that empathy and find that empathy for your partner when you're both going through something really, really horrendous, it can really save you. So, I was listening to an interview with Brene Brown not that long ago, and she was talking about how marriage isn't 50-50. We all want our marriages or our partnerships, with childcare and household chores. Like, we want that to be 50-50. We want our partners to do, their fair share. But when it comes to the emotional side of marriage, how you show up emotionally, that's rarely going to be able to be 50-50. Just imagine your partner walks through the door and they've had a really bad day at work. They got a fighting with their boss. They got a really terrible phone call from a friend who just got a cancer diagnosis. They walk in and they say to you, like, I'm at a 20. Can you pick up the other 80 today?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I just can't do it. And so it's so important to communicate where you are emotionally, so that you can find that kindness, you can find that patience with each other instead of blowing up. And this happened to us when we were in Montana. I had to dig deep and to be able to find, to figure out where we were as a couple and what Nick needed in those moments.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we got back to our cabin after we found out that William was dead, we were able to spend a little bit of time with him, but we had this immediate need to get out of Montana. It felt so unsafe. And somehow home back in Massachusetts felt safe. So we needed to get out of Montana. But there was a lot of work to do in order to get us home. And we were alone. There was another family with us, but they weren't close friends with us. So it was on us. We didn't have any family members there to help us. And we got back to our cabin, and Nick was incapacitated. He was feeling that burden of guilt. He thought that if he had gotten to William sooner, if he had found him, that he might have been able to save William. It turns out later we found out that William died on impact when he hit a tree, but we didn't know that at the time. So Nick was he was broken.
Mm-hmm.
And so I recognized that, and I stepped in with that 100%, and I packed all of our things, including William's things. I had to check us out of the cabin. I had to call the airline and get us flights out the next day. I had to do it all, right? I wanted to curl up and cry as well, but I knew that somebody had to take the lead. And so I picked up where Nick couldn't step in that day.
Yeah, and that empathy would serve us so many more times throughout this journey, particularly as we got back to Massachusetts and everything starts to just kind of hit you, and we each of us began our own unique journeys of grief. That's when empathy really was super important. You see, Susie and I grieve very differently. She's what you call an intuitive griever. She is more extroverted. She emotes openly. She has no problem crying in front of people or talking about her feelings, and that's just the way that she did it.
Nick, on the other hand, is an instrumental griever. He goes inside. He's very internal with his grieving process. He rarely cried, and I don't think ever cried in public. He developed a meditation practice, and that's how he connected with William. Some instrumental grievers need like an outlet, a physical outlet for their grief as well. They build a monument or start a 5K. Nick wrote a book, My Teacher, My Son, which will be on sale at the bookstore tomorrow.
So I want to stress this notion of empathy because it's so important, whether it's losing someone in your family or whatever challenge you face. The fact is that any family, any couple is made up of different people, right? That's obvious, I know. And different people will process challenges differently based on gender, upbringing, culture, life experiences, whatever baggage they bring to the table. We're all different, and we all process things differently. And if I had judged the way Susie was grieving, or she had judged me, that would have just created resentment between us. And that would have probably caused more hardship than necessary. So if you are facing a challenge and your partner or someone else in your family is processing it differently, don't judge them, right? Just get curious, ask them about what's going on. And you'll find that they're probably processing it just in their own unique way, and that's fine. What's most important is to be empathetic and give them the space to do it in a way that is true to who they are.
So while empathy and sort of seeing each other for who we were very important in our early grief journey, asking for help was another really critical piece. You know, I knew that even before we left Montana, that we were going to need help. This crisis was bigger than just the two of us. And it reminds me of a time when William was in first grade. He was having pretty severe anxiety attacks, panic attacks, temper tantrums, and you know, I would try. I tried my best to help him. I tried to sit with him. I tried to soothe him. I tried to fix him. And inevitably, it would end in me yelling at him and making it worse. And so finally, I realized, like, this isn't going anywhere. I am doing more harm than good. And so I called in a professional, and we took him to this psychiatrist who taught him about his brain chemistry and labeled his feelings. And he was able to sort of talk through his feelings with himself. And he actually graduated from therapy only about a month, before he died. And that was one of the proudest parenting moments I have ever had, recognizing that I could not help my child and finding somebody who really could. And you know, the death of William was so much larger in scale than his anxiety attacks. So I knew instinctually that we needed to staff up. We got home from Montana. I immediately called my superintendent. I live in a very small town, Carlisle, Massachusetts, like 5,000 people. And the school is the heart of our town, and it's a K-8 school. William was in third grade. This death was going to affect every single person in that school because it was such a tight-knit community. I called our minister, who came over and sat with us immediately, helped us plan the funeral, and got us to understand spirituality and our connection to faith. I asked my brother and his wife to be accountable for our marriage. We needed like an outside source to sort of watch us and see if we were starting to veer off track from one another. Who else did I call? I called a lot of people. I called our pediatrician because I was worried that the trauma had somehow affected our son Kai's physical health. I just had no idea. And so I called as many people as I could to support us.
Yeah. Now, asking for help may seem obvious to many people, but for some it's not. So there's been many times in my life where I was confronting a challenge and I've been accused of being a bit of a lone wolf, because I always thought, well, if I just handle it myself, it's a bit more efficient. I don't have to get a bunch of people I can just focus on it. But as Susie mentioned, this thing was so big, right, that there was no way that going it alone was an option. And the thing about asking for help is it requires you to be vulnerable. And many people aren't comfortable doing that, right? Because particularly when you're facing a challenge, whatever that challenge may be, often there comes associated shame with that. So being vulnerable, right, means exposing that shame. But it is so important to just put it out there. And the counterintuitive thing about being vulnerable is that when you're vulnerable, you invite others to be vulnerable. Susie mentioned that I wrote a book, and in that book, it's like the biggest act of vulnerability I've ever done, right? I just pour myself onto the page, and I can't tell you how many times I've reconnected with people I haven't talked to in like 30 years, and because they read my book and received my vulnerability, they were willing to be vulnerable with me. It's a very powerful thing, and it's one of the beautiful things about how we connect as human beings if we allow ourselves to do it. The other thing about being vulnerable, if you're someone facing a challenge, is it makes you human. It humanizes you, right? Because if you don't do that, you become those people, right? You're those people who lost a child, or those people whose marriage is on the rocks, or those people whose kid is having this or that challenge. So just put yourself out there, and it's an invitation for others to be by your side. And that's so important, because whatever challenge you're facing, you're going to feel alone, and you need that support system behind you, and vulnerability is sort of the unlock to get you there.
So like Nick said, it is often hard to ask for help from a broad audience. So sometimes it's really helpful to find a specific group, a specific population of people that you can open up to. And that happened for us. Only a few months after William died, we found this wonderful grief support group for families. And when we first started, I was carrying so much of that shame that Nick was talking about. I was a stay-at-home mom when William died. My only job was to keep him alive, right? That's it. And I had failed. He died on my watch. And I was so ashamed. And I felt so much guilt. And I felt like this terrible, terrible mother. And so I walked into Jeff's place just carrying that backpack of shame. And we have this beautiful ritual that we do at Jeff's place. It's the name of our group. And there's my old thesis advisor. Thank you for coming. I told them I was always late for your class, so it's fine. So there I am with my backpack of shame. And at Jeff's place, we have this beautiful ritual. You start off the night. Every parent lights a candle, and they say their dead child's name. And I watched as every parent did that, going around the circle. And I realized that those parents looked just like me, right? They were loving, kind, present parents who had suffered a terrible accident, horrible tragedy, or a terrible medical diagnosis, and their child died. And so it was so comforting to me to not feel isolated anymore. I was in this group of people who had gone through the exact same thing as me. And I felt seen and witnessed and cared for in that group. It's also been an amazing place for my son Kai, who is now 13. In Carlisle, William was the first child in over 30 years who had died. So Kai was all alone at his school. There was nobody else who had lost a sibling. There was nobody on his sports teams that had lost a sibling. None of our friends or family members had ever lost a sibling like he did. And I imagine that would feel so isolating for him to be the only person in his entire community to have lost a sibling, but not at Jeff's place, right? Every single person at Jeff's place that he interacted with had lost a sibling too. And so it was so important for him to feel seen and valued. And he learned coping mechanisms. He learned how to honor his brother, how to remember his brother. And now my 4.5-year-old son goes too, which is a really beautiful thing. He's never met William, but he's learning how to remember and honor his brother too. So if you're not comfortable sort of opening up in just a wide population, finding that specific type of support for whatever you're going through can be really, really helpful.
Yeah, it really is an amazing organization. And again, it goes back to that notion of not feeling alone, because you're already facing whatever you're facing, and then that's just that feeling of aloneness. It kind of pours over you, and it's very difficult. But asking for help for us was also made a lot easier because of the community we lived in. So we live in a small town called Carlisle, Massachusetts, about 5,000 people, and as Susie mentioned, the school is the center of town, and that town enveloped us with their love, their care, their support. I grew up in Manhattan. When I would get home from school, I would ride the elevator up to the 8th floor, shut the front door behind me, and the outside world was gone. Like, I didn't know, I'd never experienced community like I had after William died, and it really was just an amazing sort of display of humanity. And I give all the credit to Susie. I often say that if left to my own devices, I'd be a hermit. But Susie was a very active member of our community. She was on school committee. She was active in the Unitarian Church in our town. And so the town knew who we were, right? Which made it that much easier for them to support us in this really difficult time. So for those of you who, like me, never placed any sort of priority on building community, let me assure you that whatever challenge you face, if you have a strong community behind you, it can be incredibly powerful. Yeah.
So the strength of us as a couple and finding that empathy and then the courage to ask for help were really critical in those early weeks and months after William died. But there comes a point in any crisis that it becomes a lot less acute, right? things start to settle down. Things go back to normal. For us, it was a brand new normal, and it was very uncomfortable. We no longer had William, but Nick had gone back to work.
Mm-hmm.
Kai was back at school playing with his friends. And so we had to figure out, like, how do we move forward? Now what? What do we do now that we no longer have William? You know, there's sort of like a fork in the road moment where you have a choice to make. One of those choices is sort of go down that dark road. And we were exposed to that dark road pretty early in our grief journey. About 3 weeks after William died, we were really looking to connect with other parents who had lost a child. We heard about a support group for parents in the neighboring town, and so we decided to go because, again, we were looking for that connection. We just wanted to know what we could do.
Mm-hmm.
And we showed up that night, and there was just 2 other people there. And one of them was an older gentleman. He was the moderator for the night. And he started the group by telling us his story. He said that over 30 years ago, one of his children had died. And since her death, he had never had a good day in his life.
Yeah.
That he had never found joy again. And that angry truth hit Nick and I like a freight train. And we walked out of that meeting. We never went back to that group. But we vowed to never be like that old man. Like, he showed us that we had a choice in how we were going to proceed in our life without William. He showed us a path of darkness and bitterness, and we chose the path of love.
Yeah. It was, I just want to echo how we just wanted some sense that there was hope. And when we heard what that gentleman said, it hit us like a freight train, as Susie said. And so, we chose the path of love, and that path of love is really, it's a path of self-empowerment, resilience, and agency. Because at the end of the day, one of the harshest lessons we've learned out of all of this is that control is an illusion, but the only thing we can control is how we react to whatever life throws at us. And that's what we decided to do. We decided to choose love, to choose a path of resilience. And the way we did that was by trying to make meaning out of even the darkest of tragedies. And each of us did that in our own unique ways.
For me, making meaning came by looking outward and doing service. And it took a few years to want to actively give back to my community, my grieving community. But when I was ready, I recognized that William's friends, especially, were still grieving, obviously, a few years after his death, but they didn't have the supports like I did. There are grief groups for parents. There are we went to therapy. I went on different retreats. I've done grief trainings. These kids didn't have those and their parents didn't have those kind of resources. So I felt like I had all this knowledge on how to walk through grief that I wanted to share with these kids, with these parents of William's friends. So we started a nonprofit. It's called Williams Be Yourself Challenge. And it started out as this organization to challenge kids to show up as themselves, even in their hardest moments, even in their big emotional challenges. And we started putting on a few events per year. There's a movement event that we do. There's a remembrance event that we do during William's birthday, where we invite the entire community to remember the loved ones that they have lost and say their names, because it's so healing and powerful to say our dead people's names. And we're not often given the space to do that. And then we do an educational lecture on some sort of mental health topic, along with some other things thrown in there. We have a kids club at school where they do service projects. We just had a Frisbee tournament. So we just try to give the kids agency over how they're feeling. We allow them to plan these events. But I've also done a lot of work in the grief space myself. And so I've decided to sort of expand the mission of WBYC to help more grieving families. So we just started an initiative we're calling the Greenhouse. And once we raise the money, we will be buying a single family home where I'm from on Cape Cod, so that we will be able to send grieving families who have lost either a parent or a child on free week-long vacations or retreats, so that they have the time and the space to come together as a family, to reconnect, to start their path forward. We were very lucky in our grief journey. Nick was able to take 6 months off of work. The standard bereavement leave is 0 to 3 days.
Yeah.
It's just horrendous. And so we recognize how important it is to give families that time and space. And so we're hoping to at least help out in that way. Bless you. And I'm so honored to be able to do this work in William's memory. It's creating a legacy for him that he's no longer able to create.
Yeah. So as you can tell, Susie and I are very different, opposites attract. And so Susie's way of making meaning was to tap into her natural extroverted way and community-oriented way. I went inward. I'm an introvert, proud of it. And so I went inward. My way of processing what happened. I had this intense need to make meaning out of this thing because I couldn't let what happened to William be this random, senseless event. And for me, meaning meant I needed to learn from it. Because when you lose your child, your own mortality stares you in the face, and you realize how fragile life is. And you realize this is it. This is one life we all have that we know about, right? And I had to figure out, well, what can I learn so I can live my life differently, better, whatever you want to call it. And so every morning for 4 or 5 months after William died, I went into this room every morning, and I would sit and I would meditate, and I would ask the question, what can I learn from this? And lessons, not every time, but some lessons would come to me, and I would quickly write them down in a journal. And then as I continued this process, I eventually stopped doing things only with my head, because that was my natural way of doing things. I like to intellectualize things, but eventually learned how to start processing with my heart. And one day, out of the blue, I had this totally random urge to write a poem. And so I wrote a poem. And it was a really great way for me to get my feelings and emotions onto the page. And so that one poem turned into 15 poems, and I said, well, I want to share these because I think there's something to them. But the poems weren't enough, so I decided to write chapters that go along with the poems that kind of describe the poem as well as a lesson that the poem tries to teach. And so that's what I did. I wrote a book, My Teacher, My Son. And my thinking was I had learned so much from this horrible tragedy that is helping and continues to help me. And I wanted to share that because I wanted to share it with the world, because we all face stuff. That's life. We're going to face stuff, and I think these lessons can be valuable. And like Susie, for me, this is a way of allowing William's legacy to endure.
So February 19th marked 6 years without William. And I really can't believe that we have survived 6 years without him. It really feels like yesterday that he was eating waffles at our breakfast counter, practicing for his parkour competition up in our rug room, winning 3rd place in his ski race, on his last ski race before he died. But in those moments, those dark moments when he first died, like, we couldn't see past the next hour or the next day. We had no understanding of how we were going to make it to the next day or week, month, or year. And here we are six years later. And I am so proud. I truly am so proud of who we have become, how we have navigated this journey. Before William died, we thought, our life was great. We were on top of the world. We were climbing up our mountain, and Nick had this wonderful job. I was a stay-at-home mom to 2 healthy, beautiful kids. We lived in this beautiful community. Things couldn't have been better. And then out of nowhere, no warning, completely knocked down off that first mountain into this dark, dark valley. But we are climbing up our 2nd mountain now. And I think we're doing it with a lot more purpose and a lot more clarity of who we want to be. And that clarity comes from an experience that we had in the moments after our son Bodhi was born. Like I said, he's almost 5. He was born in the height of the pandemic, July of 2020. So we were very, very scared. We had just suffered, a year prior, the loss of William. And then we were worried about having Bodhi. And to top it all off, when at our 18-week scan, he was diagnosed with a congenital lung defect, and they didn't know if he was going to be able to breathe on his own when he was born. So we were terrified of what would happen. But after a long and hard labor, those first cries that he took when he entered this world were some of the most beautiful sounds I have ever heard. Yeah. And we FaceTimed immediately with our son Kai, who was awaiting Bodhi's arrival at home. He couldn't be with us because of COVID. But you know, we were sweaty and gross and tired. Bodhi still was covered in all sorts of stuff.
I think there's a picture of it.
Yeah,
coming
there's
up here.
there's a picture.
Yeah,
but,
there it is.
You know, we felt like we had finally been able to become a new family again in that moment. You know, and there was so much love and joy in that singular moment, because we had made the choice to let love in. We had made the choice to have another child and try again, right? We wanted to do it for ourselves. We wanted to do it for our son Kai. And it was so very hard to do. It was so hard sometimes to choose that joy. But we showed up for one another as a couple. We witnessed each other as a couple. We were vulnerable, and we were able to ask our community for help. Mm-hmm. We decided to take the path of love and try to make meaning out of what had happened to us. And I'm so proud of us for what we've been able to do and how far we've come. And I really think that we're better people for what has happened to us. Thank you guys very much for listening. So we'd love to chat about anything, about our family, about your grief, your challenges.
Yeah, any questions? Yeah, please.
Very powerful.
Thank you.
The only thing I would quibble with is you use the word, meaning a lot. And off the top of my head, not the right word.
Meaning, you're saying?
Meaning,
yeah.
To find meaning
Mm-hmm.
in what happened. I'm not sure you can find meaning in what happened. You could do everything you've done, and that's great. But I'm not sure that's meaning. You know, I don't think this event can be rationalized or
No.
or be meaningful in any way.
I get that.
Yeah, well, it's. I guess that's how you define meaning. It's not. It wasn't. It wasn't. It wasn't a. It wasn't motivated by trying to rationalize what happened. It was trying to make light out of darkness, is what it was.
Yeah, I mean, I hate that phrase, like everything happens for a reason, like that I know that doesn't fly with me, because there's no reason my son should have died, right? But in making meaning, I think I'm trying to make meaning of my own life.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Like, how can I now live my life in a meaningful way? I'm not trying to rationalize what happened to William. Yeah. There will never be good answers. But now that he is dead, what am I faced with, and how am I going to continue on in my life? I've got to find some meaning and purpose for myself.
Yeah.
Much better expressed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are you still attending the support sessions?
100%. I am.
I am no longer. I just, for me, it ran its course for me. But they still go. Susie goes with the boys, and yeah.
It's unbelievably supportive, and a lot of people graduate after a few years, and I'm hoping to hold on at least through Kai's high school career, because again, it's the only place that he has these other people in his life who have lost siblings, and I'm just hoping they don't kick us out. One of the beauties, and I was talking to what's your name, Kristen, of a lot of these programs, they're free of charge for grieving families. Because people recognize how important these types of services are. And so that's why I say they might kick us out. If they need space for families who are in more acute need, I would certainly step aside. But I love the programming. It's so impactful. So yeah, they're just fantastic. Yes.
Thank you for sharing your story. It's very powerful, as Miles already said. I'm curious, as someone who's never experienced, but who has had friends and acquaintances experience some form of what you guys have described. What were some of the most kind of meaningful words or gestures that other people, initially and then maybe even longer after, did for you that you were able to feel some warmth or
Yeah.
I'd love to know that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to start?
I can start, then you can. Yeah,
Okay.
sure. So I think it's a great question, and it's hard, right? Because many people don't know what to do when they confront someone who's lost a loved one, and then when there's someone who's lost a child, it's such a, it's so. And I think a lot of people actually, instead of walking towards it, they walk away from it, right? So first and foremost, you have to be willing to walk towards it, which may require you to be vulnerable. And also, I think there's an overemphasis on the words. I think people get what should I say? What am I going to say to this person? It doesn't matter if you show up. I mean, there's things that you shouldn't say, and Susie's got a great list of things you shouldn't say.
We're on my website.
But it's just about showing up and being there for another person, right? And the words don't really matter. I remember I was talking to a friend of mine, and I could tell in his heart he was trying to find the words, and he was just like, he was struggling so much, but I could just sense that he wanted to be there for me. I said, look, there are no words. Like, I let him off the hook because just his sheer act of being there and his effort was enough for me. So yeah, don't emphasize the words. Just show up as a friend, as a caring human being.
Yeah, on my website, I have some things that you probably don't want to say to people in profound grief, like, oh, well, yeah, I know just how you feel. My cat just died. Like, just wrong. But especially like when you show up for these people, you don't want to compare in those moments. Like, maybe a different time, but if you're showing up to be with someone, don't talk about the losses that you've suffered recently. You're there for them in that moment. Grievers really want to be witnessed in their grief. They want to be seen and heard. So sometimes just the sheer act of somebody sitting beside you saying, I'm here, I've got you. You don't necessarily have to say very much at all.
Yeah.
And let them guide you. Another wonderful thing to do is to continuously talk about their child. Like, I always want to talk about William. That's why we're here today. I love hearing stories about William that other people might hold that I didn't get to know. Like, some friends from school tell me something. It's so valuable to me because there's no more new memories to be made with William. So continuously saying their names, asking things like, oh, what was his favorite thing to do? Where would you have wanted to go with him? So that William is still alive in my life. We all want our people to be remembered. Like, I want to talk about my living children and share stories about them just as much as I do about my dead child. Yeah. And that makes a lot of people uncomfortable to talk about my dead child, but he's just as important and valuable. And so giving people that space to share about their dead child, dead parent, dead sibling is really, really a huge thing.
Yeah. One other thing, and we just gave a talk for another group this week. Ask, how can I support you? We try to guess, right? We can't possibly know what the person needs, so just ask. What would be most helpful for you right now? Right?
Do you want to talk about it, or do you just want to sit? Yeah. Do you want me to show up, in a spiritual way and talk about where your loved one might be, or do you want to be really rational about it?
Yeah.
And talk about how terribly awful this is? Like, check in with them because they might be able to guide you. What else did I want to say? I don't know. No, you were talking about ask. Oh, I know, but like, especially in the very early stages when like all the meal trains are starting to come out, and you want to be able to support the people in their very early grief or the very early crisis. Like, if you're a cook, great, sign up for the meal train. But like, if you're not a cook, don't cook. Like, take out their garbage. We had people doing our laundry for months. People would take our children just to give, Kai, not our children, Kai, just to give us a break and to give him some playtime. Maybe you're really good at taking walks, so you want to walk with them. Maybe you're good at organizing a 5K, so do that. But do what you're really good at when you show up. You don't want to be your false self when you're trying to support somebody. And there's always going to be somebody who can cook.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Tell us a little more about the foundation, how that's going.
Oh, I will. Thank you, John, very much. So yeah, I think we're in year 3. We founded it in 2022.
Oh yeah, wow.
And we're a 501c3 nonprofit. We're an all volunteer board, an organization. So it's hard, but like I said, we started out with these wonderful community events that we still do. But I'm really excited about our the greenhouse initiative, because I feel like that's going to serve such a larger population. And we started fundraising back in December, and we are over $320,000 of our $2 million goal. So we have a long way to go, but we're getting a lot of really great feedback from a lot of other grief support groups. And grief-centric organizations. They're recognizing that this is sort of a gap in support for grieving families. There's a whole lot of grief support groups and grief retreats and that sort of thing for groups and multiple members of family members, but there's nothing just for one individual family at a time to sort of take that needed time out, if you will, sort of away from all of the distractions. Like, we needed to get out of our house sometimes because it reminded us too much of William. We'd walk by his room and he wasn't there. So it was really helpful for us to find a new place, to make new memories with our surviving son. And so that's what we're really aspiring to do for these families. So we're trying to get the word out. We're trying to spread our mission. We have a wonderful website, williamsbeyourselfchallenge.org. I also write a Substack, and it's linked there. I write letters to William. It's called Dear William, and it's been a really meaningful way for me to connect with him. While I'm writing, I imagine conversing with him, and so that's been really, really special. But I'm sharing that out with the world. So if you're out there looking for some Substack reads, it's Dear William. Yeah, things are going really, really well. But we're trying to do things like this to sort of promote that grief awareness, that so many families need help. 1 in 11 children in the United States will suffer the death of a parent or a child before they turn 18. 1 in 11 is a lot.
It's wild, right? You don't think that, but it's...
Somebody recently told me that they thought grief was sort of a niche topic. I'm like, 1 in 11 is not niche. So there are so many families like ours out there, who don't necessarily have the same voice that Nick and I do, or can't have the same voice. And so, we're really, really honored to be able to bring some light to grief. And make it normalize it. Like, it's so important to normalize it.
Along those lines, and thank you so much for this. I work at an independent school in New Hampshire, and we're going to have a class on grief.
Yes, there's some people doing great grief education work.
We have an incredible group on campus called Fight Club, which is for students who have lost an immediate family member. And they did an unbelievable assembly this year, and we had a speaker whose name escapes me right now. But she sort of talked about, she did this imagery of grief as a can of paint being poured over. And we all closed our eyes. There were probably close to 1,000 people in the room.
Wow.
And that she had us imagine where the grief would land on our body.
Yeah.
And so my takeaway from that experience was that like you, I would intellectualize it, right?
Yeah.
That we don't, as different cultures and different parts of society talk about grief in very different ways, but we don't always talk about it.
No.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily a field of study.
Right.
And so I think what we're doing at our school is explaining it as a field of study. So I'm curious what resources you found to be helpful as you navigated your grief journey to learn about it.
Sure.
Yeah, and that's a double-edged sword, because I'll talk about my experience, and people would send me all kinds of books, and they're, I was super thankful. I think a lot of the tried and true books on grief, they paint it as this sort of very linear process, right? Denial and shock, and I remember reading those books. I'm like, crap, that's not how I'm doing it, right? And I seem to be hanging out on this step way much longer than they seem to paint it. So it was helpful in one sense, but then I found myself being very self-judgmental, right? About like, I'm like failing at grief. This is not feeling good. So I think for me, it was a double-edged sword. It is helpful a little bit, but if you start to try to, it is so unique, right? I think that to me is the biggest learning. Grief is so unique to each and every one of us. And like I said, I'm not a huge crier, and I had to learn how to be okay with that. And it was like,
and I had to learn how to be okay with that.
Right.
At first I was like, aren't you sad? Don't you miss him? And it's like, oh no, he just has a completely different way.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was like
expressing himself.
It was 2 years later when I started writing my book, I realized, oh, well, that's how I grieved. I went into William's room and I meditated. That was my way of doing it. So they're helpful, and you got to be careful not to feel like you need to be beholden to some process.
Our first resource was our psychiatrist. Who sort of took our family of 3 and taught us about emotional response, right? And then that grew into our family grief support, where we would all sit together and share. One of the best things was the modeling that we got to see, because when we entered Jeff's place, there were families who had been there for 5 years. And so they would sort of tell us their experiences. And that was so helpful for us to see, oh, this might happen, or that could happen. And now I get to do that with the new families who come, sort of say like what my trajectory has been. And it may not be their trajectory, but at least they have some understanding of what could come up for them. And then I went on a grief retreat with a grief therapist, which was also amazing. And I learned all sorts of things. That's where I learned to write to William, because I was writing about him. And then, we started our nonprofit. I started to connect with other nonprofits in the grief space. And I'm going to a conference next week for the National Alliance of Grieving Children. So there's all these big resources out there. They're just not known too much about outside of the world of grief. But in those conferences, I went to another conference called End Well. It's all about how to end your life well.
Well, yeah, like not suicide.
No,
but like,
no, not that. Like how to take care of
hospice
yourself,
and things of that nature,
and then bereavement care. And there was a young man who had just started a grief education class for his students, teaching them, reading some grief literature, and then teaching them all about, documents that you want to have so that your spouse doesn't have to make a terrible decision if you're sick, like all of these things that we don't know about.
Yeah.
We're all going to die. It's like we're all going to go through either our own death or a loved one's death, and yet it's something that we just don't talk about.
Yeah.
Or we talk about it too late.
Well, we push it away, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we say, I'll worry about that when, but when can sneak up on you, as we know, like that.
I asked my mother not that long ago. I had just come from a friend's dad's funeral, so somebody, a peer of my mother. I asked her, Mom, what do you want for your funeral? And she has planned like 5 funerals for other my dad, my aunt, a couple of aunts, her parents. And she's like, oh gosh, I've never even thought about it. I was like, how could you not think about it? Like, you've gone through all these other, but it was something I think she's just been pushing away. Because we don't think about it or don't talk about it at the dinner table. It's
we're wired.
too
We're wired
taboo.
not to. Right? We're
Yeah.
wired. As a species, we're wired not to think about our death. We've been wired since the dawn of our species to survive. So we're programmed not to. But I think, we should be thinking about it because we'll need to support either ourselves or some friends or some loved ones. And so I think the resources are there, but you have to kind of find them. I think that's part of the problem.
And I think that our son Kai, who's now 13, I mean, he is so grief informed.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
he has gotten the opportunity to sit in his grief with all these other people and these trained professionals. So he's a really unbelievable kid because of this stuff that he's learned. He's just that much more aware. Now he's also 13, making terrible choices. And just a little bit more thoughtful than his peers.
Yeah.
Well, it's 4:00, guys.
Yeah.
I don't want to keep you unless does anyone have any?